Good evening and welcome to this community event, Is It Safe? 5G and Wireless Radiation. Thank you very much for supporting Teenage Cancer Trust and Pink Ladies. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Devra Davis that changed her schedule to be here with us for 24 hours. She has a 40-page resume which would take me about 2 hours to read to you. She was a presidential appointee, a White House advisor, World Health Organization. Green America gave her a Lifetime Award. She was a senior scientist on Al Gore's Nobel Peace Prize team. So she's come here to present the evidence about 5G and wireless radiation for all of you to listen to. And please afterwards ask all your questions, which Devra's looking forward to. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Devra Davis. Thank you.
Good evening. It's just delightful to come to this beautiful place, and I only regret that I'm only planning to be here for one day this time, but I can see why so many people are drawn to such a beautiful, spectacular place and why you are one of the healthiest and happiest places in the world. And I'd like to talk with you this evening about what you may do to maintain that status. I am going to share with you some observations from my 40 years of work in public health research. I've written a couple books. These are two of them. But what I want to talk with you about tonight is evidence. How do we know? How do we know that there is any reason for concern? After all, wireless radiation's been around now almost 30 years, and people are still apparently fine. And the answer is, we know from 3 different types of studies. Exposure and modeling studies can tell us how much radiation gets into the human body, and indeed how much gets into animals as well. We also have experiments on animals and cell cultures, and I want to stress the reason we do experiments on animals is to predict and prevent human harm. Think about drug testing, right? Drugs are developed by being first tested in animals and then clinically tested in people. So we get data from studies on animals all the time, and we rely on it in order to test drugs. We also use it to test environmental chemicals, like asbestos, vinyl chloride, and we use the results of those data. Ideally, we use those results to prevent human harm, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Finally, we have epidemiologic studies and clinical observations. The word epidemiology comes from 2 Greek words, epi meaning upon and demos meaning the people. Epidemiology looks at patterns upon the people, patterns of disease, patterns of health, and we look at those patterns in order to understand the past, because epidemiology can only tell you about the past. When you ask for proof of harm, you're basically saying, how much evidence do we have that people have already become sick or damaged from these exposures that have taken place? Now, in the United States and for much of the world, the Federal Communications Commission has set exposure test guidelines for radio frequency in 1996. In 1996, when petrol cost pennies compared to what it costs now, you could rent a flat for very little as well. The standards for today's phones, for all 7 billion of these, were set more than 23 years ago. They are outdated, and at the time they were set, they were based solely on one thing: how do you avoid heating up the brain? They only account for the short-term effects, but most importantly, the standard was developed based on a very tall, very heavy-set male at the 98th percentile for military recruits at that time, and do not reflect the majority of people in the world today. And that's what the standards, unfortunately, are still based on. They take a big bowling ball, plastic, empty head, you see that right there, and they fill it with fluid, homogeneous fluid. Now, you know, that your brain is not one homogeneous thing. It has many components to it. And yet that's the thing that gets tested to see what temperature it might reach with a cell phone. And the cell phone, by the way, is located with a spacer, not directly next to the head. And for the body, a cell phone can be put as far as an inch off the body for testing. Children, not surprisingly, absorb much more radiation than adults. And the World Health Organization in 2011 commented that the child's bone marrow of the skull can absorb up to 10 times more radiation than that of the adult. Now, this work is work that we did in Brazil with Claudio Fernandez and Álvaro de Salas. And I should add that Álvaro de Salas is one of almost a dozen scientists who've written to officials here in Guernsey in an effort to explain what we do know about wireless radiation. And this is some of the work out of their federal laboratory at University of Porto Alegre. That federally sponsored research has demonstrated that when you simulate exposure using a method that the government has approved, you find that the exposure gets all the way through to the eyes of a child. You see here the eyes, and only halfway, if the phone is here, into the adult. Now, interestingly, this is simulating virtual reality. How many of you have seen a virtual reality device? How many of you have tried using one? All right. Often they're held right here, right? And they're never tested. They're never tested for absorption because it's not required. They're only tested with that big empty bowling ball head that I showed you before. And what we did is to show what virtual reality would do to a child. And yet, in many countries, including my own, in some locations, they're pushing virtual reality as a learning tool for children without realizing that this may be explaining why growing numbers of children today need glasses and are having vision problems as well as hearing problems. Now, this little animation is going to show you what is on your phone. I would appreciate you are keeping your phones on airplane mode or off, but I want you to watch what happens here. Thank you for the cue. All right. When you go to your phone, you will see that if you go to settings on your phone, and this will work in a moment. This is settings right there. You click on it, and then you click on general, which is right there, and then you click on about at the top, and then you go all the way down to something you've never seen before, legal, there. And that gets you to RF exposure. And there you have the information that is, by the way, in every phone that everyone has. You have some equivalent of this. And it's telling you that phones are tested at 5 millimeter distance from the body. What it doesn't tell you is that every single millimeter off the body reduces your exposure 15%. And I have been concerned about this for many years, and I said repeatedly that if phones were a drug, they would be illegal because they have never been tested for safety and there is no surveillance to follow up to see what is happening to people now as a consequence. This is what I want you to understand. And let me ask, how many of you have a background in science and biology? Just for my information. So you will bear with me as I explain some very basic things here. We test animals under controlled conditions with standards for protocols that involve taking rodents and exposing them in their lifetimes. In their 2-year lifetimes, we expose the rodents to as much exposure as humans would get in their 70-plus years of life. That's the standard way of testing animals. Now, that test was done in the US with over $30 million with the cooperation of the Swiss government's National Institute for Evaluating and Measuring Exposure. They did the exposure chambers, Swiss engineers. And the conclusion of that study, with the results you see here, I'll translate it a bit. A schwannoma is a thickening of nerve cells. These are cells around, they're fatty cells that grow around nerves to protect them. A schwannoma can occur in the heart of animals exposed to this radiation. It's extremely rare, an extremely rare tumor. It's also rare for rodents to develop brain tumors, glioblastoma, very rare. In this study, these animals developed rare and highly malignant tumors of the brain, of the heart, of the medulla oblongata. In addition, in multiple parts of the animal, we were able to look at the DNA and see that there was DNA damage. Now, why is DNA damage important? You all get DNA damage all the time. It's called part of life. And if you're healthy and you live here, you're eating well and taking care of yourselves, your DNA damage gets repaired naturally. And that's what keeps us going all the time. But if you have an excessive rate of DNA damage and you have multiple organs with DNA damage, then it's very problematic. So there were statistically significant increases in multiple tumors in this huge study done by the US government. But the response has been to try to discredit the US National Toxicology Program, to challenge the validity of the test protocol. Ironically, the people challenging it now are some of the same people that set it up and approved it in the first place, because they never expected these results. Nobody did. The study was set up to prove what we call the null hypothesis, namely that there is no effect of cell phone radiation. That's how you do science. You try to set it up to get that finding, and guess what? This study is not a one-off study. This study is not a unique study. This study, in fact, is a corroboration of many other studies that have found damage to DNA, weakening of membranes, increasing reactive oxygen species, which is another biochemical indicator of damage that we know of. The NTP results are important because they support the conclusion that the World Health Organization reached in 2011. And that conclusion said that at that time, 2011, at that time, there was enough evidence to conclude that cell phone radiation was a possible human carcinogen. And that evidence consisted of the same three things that I had showed you at the beginning, namely evidence on exposure, evidence from animal studies, which had been accumulating at that point, and compellingly, human studies as of 2011, human studies that found that people who use cell phones the most for 10 years or more had a 50% greater chance of developing brain tumors. And now we have new data. The new data show that people who use cell phones, that start to use them as children, have 4 to 8 times more brain cancer by the time they're in middle age. 4 to 8 times. Now, brain cancer is a rare cancer. That's the good news. But the increase that we're seeing here is quite worrisome. And we're seeing it not in studies in Sweden by Leonard Hardell and his team, as well as a French national study done by INSERM, one of the major French research institutions. So it's not that there's only one study. It's not that there's unique results. There's a cumulative weight of evidence. And that's what I want to talk with you about in the remainder of my talk today. One thing we know about 5G is it's very fast. And the way that the systems work, 3G and 4G work at 900 million to 2.4 billion cycles a second. That's really fast. 5G works at between 5 billion to 100 billion cycles a second. 100 billion cycles a second. Well, as a matter of fact, there's growing evidence that this can be therapeutic, providing that the exposure is continuous. Think about it like this. That sound is calming and quiet and peaceful. But what about this? Bop, 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 bop. That is the sound of your cell phone. Your cell phone is constantly looking for a signal from the tower. It's called a handshake. And when it finds it, it goes beep, beep. And so it's constantly going up to a peak and coming back down. Now, if you've ever survived teenagers, and I think many of us have, that's what it's like living with a teenager. They're constantly, right? It's challenging in life to deal with any phenomenon that is constantly going like this and then coming back down. And the theory that is evolving now among the scientists who study this, as I do, is that it's the constant exposure to these peaks over time that is most damaging biologically. It weakens membranes. One of the things we know from 5mm waves, they're very small and they uniquely resonate with the sweat duct that people have. We have millions of sweat ducts. Well, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with it except that just below the surface of your skin, you have potential melanocytes. Those are cells that can form cancer. You have precancerous exposures because you've been alive and you've lived here and maybe you didn't know about sunscreen when you were younger. So as a consequence, you're going to get exposure to your skin from 5G millimeter waves. And the Israeli physicists have shown that sweat glands act as helical antennas when exposed. And in addition, 5G accelerates the growth of bacteria and viruses. Think about this in terms of the problem of antibiotic resistance that we already have. Now, cell phone radiation, and this is again a simulation that we've done with our colleagues in Brazil. If you look carefully at this simulation of the exposure here, you will see that the radiation is highest into the testis and the penis. There is no bone to protect that part of a man's anatomy, and so it absorbs the highest radiation of any part of the human body. And what we've done in studies with animals is we have shown that there are some unique types of damage that form in the testis from this exposure in animal studies that have been done. And this, you can see here the controls. Even if you know no biology, you see that nice white boundary. That's a cell border. And that's what you want. You want your cells to be nice and round and have integrity. But this is what has happened with the exposed cells. They have lost the boundaries. They've lost the cell wall. Sometimes the nucleus has opened up. And that damage is exactly the kind of thing that we see in animal studies. And remember, we study the animals so we don't find damage in people, so we prevent harm to people. And yet, ironically, all over the world today, there's a drop in sperm count, there's increasing reports of what's called testicular dysfunction, erectile dysfunction is growing all over the world. And there are many causes for this, including tight clothing, hot tubs, alcohol, but one of the causes, in my opinion, and that of many of my colleagues, is cell phone radiation. And the Cleveland Clinic is among many institutions that tell men who want to have healthy children to get the phone out of their pocket. I have given a TEDx talk where I go into this in more detail. There's a lot of information about this out there if you're interested to pursue it further. But it's enough information that the Cleveland Clinic says, get your phone off your body. Now, synergies are very important in science, as they are in life. And this is a very important study that was done by German scientists, so bear with me for a moment while I explain it to you. They took animals and exposed them prenatally and exposed them to a carcinogen, a known carcinogen, something we know is going to cause cancer. That's what they did. They know that ethyl nitrosourea, ENU, causes liver cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma. That's clearly, we use it to study the process of cancer. So what they did is they took these animals and they exposed them to this compound, and you can see here, this is the rate of cancer, and you can see that black here, they got cancers. But interestingly, they also exposed them afterwards to RF electromagnetic fields at levels that are more like that of your base station, below that of your cell phone. And much to the shock of the scientists doing the study, they showed an interaction, so that if you get exposure to a known liver carcinogen and then you add to it electromagnetic fields at a very low level, you accelerate and you get twice as much cancer. Think about that. Twice as much cancer. This is the CNN showed a video of what happened in a study that was done in India. And they took 3 hives and they put phones in 2 of them, and one set of phones were turned on and one was not. And after a period of 2 months, what they showed was that the hive where the phone was turned on, the bees didn't dance the right way, they didn't get their act together, and by the end of that period of time, half of them had left and not come back. Now, honeybees are kind of very attractive because we know they're critical, and we all like honey, right? But honeybees are only one of the 1,000 different pollinating insects on which agriculture depends. And if you damage insects, you're damaging the fundamental basis for agriculture. And we have evidence that that is happening now because, again, there's reported declines in insects all over the world. Now, let me be very clear with you. The decline in sperm and the decline in insects is not caused only by cell phone radiation. It's not. However, these are important contributing factors based on what the science is telling us now. And this study, which is an experimental study in a natural setting, clearly showed that cell phone radiation damages honey production. But of course, you don't put phones in hives. This was done as an experiment, right? But what it does suggest is that we need to protect insects as well as the rest of us from this intense exposure. Now, this is a study of 5G, and it was published in a major publication called Scientific Reports. And again, it was triggered by the worldwide decline in insects. And it's a puzzle for science. Why are insects declining? Well, we know that there's an increase in neonicotinoid pesticides. We know that pollution is a factor. There's no question about it. But again, pollution is contributing to it. Pesticides is contributing to it. And now this is suggesting that 5G resonates exactly with the body of the insects. So you see, this is 2G, and the strength of the field is measured by how much red and yellow it has. So this is, 2G doesn't do much for an insect because it's so big, the signal is big. But this is part of what could be in 5G, and as is this. And it completely conforms to the size of the insect. And these scientists have published that this could lead to an increase in body temperature and what's called dielectric heating. And that's not a good thing. And they wrote this paper very recently urging that we look at this as a serious problem that needs to be addressed before rolling this out. And in science and in politics, there is a concept of precaution. It's better to be safe than sorry. You know that for everything. When your child goes out, you give them the umbrella. You don't wait for them to come home soaking wet. When we build a building, we build it with safety inside the building. We don't wait for it to fall down. And when it comes to planning whether or not to have 5G, we need to talk about safe G. And I will get to that at the end. Because there are ways to make technology safer. And the group that I have founded, Environmental Health Trust, is committed to making safer technology. Now, 5G has been singled out by weather forecasters. You recently had a period of rain, you often do, but it's well recognized that the periods of intense rain and storms are increasing dramatically around the world today. We've had more hurricanes, we've had more forest fires, we've had more disruptive weather and patterns than ever before. And although some people, like the President of the United States, don't believe in global warming, for scientists, it's not a matter of belief, it's not a matter of religion. We look at what's happening in the world. I like to say that I trust in God, but all others have to provide data. And what we have when it comes to data on 5G is that if you had a 5G system throughout the globe, according to NASA scientists and scientists from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, it would interfere with the ability of satellites to predict weather. It would block the ability to predict weather. And as a consequence, meteorologists at the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts and meteorologists in the US government warned about this. But in the US, here's what happened. They planned a big meeting at the National Academy of Sciences where it was going to be a bit of a scientific face-off between the scientists from NOAA and the policy wonks from the Federal Communications Commission who were rejecting their science. Now, to use a British term, the chutzpah of this is hard to imagine. Chutzpah means outrage, right? The nerve that the Federal Communications Commission was rejecting the meteorologists who were warning that this is going to interfere with the ability to predict weather. The Federal Communications Commission does not employ a single meteorologist, I can assure you. They were rejecting this because it was highly inconvenient. Highly inconvenient. And the meeting that was supposed to take place got canceled. So there never was a full airing of the science. And at the very top levels of government, which there still exist, the decision was made, we're not going to pay attention to this. I think that that is absolutely outrageous and a very poor decision. It's going to set weather prediction back 3 decades, according to the scientists involved. Now, what do we know about masks and their effects on health? We have some data. We actually have some human data, unfortunately. And I say that because I would prefer, if we relied on the animal data, to predict and prevent harm. But instead, in this case, as in many others, we are insisting on proof of human harm, and we have some. And this is a study in India that was very well done that looked at blood from people who lived closer to masts and further away. And they found significant biological effects in the blood of people who live closer to base stations. Now, I stress blood because there's an emotionality that understandably occurs when people live near a mast. And there's no denying that some people get more upset about that, and it is a psychological response, no question about it. But this study, it's hard to make psychological effects occur in your blood. This is a study of biological markers of DNA damage that had been validated and used in studies of cancer for many years. And what this study found was a significant decrease in glutathione, as an example. Glutathione is really important for detoxifying, that is, for getting bad stuff out of your body. And there was an increase in lipid peroxidation, and that means free radicals could form and go about and damage the body. And this is a significant finding, and it's not the only one, but I think this is one of the best studies done on that subject. Now, with respect to children, there's no question that they're more vulnerable, and there's a number of studies. I'm going to go through a few of them briefly now. One looked at 13,000 pairs of mothers and children, and they found that the mothers who had most prenatal exposure to cell phone radiation had children with much more higher rates of increased hyperactivity. Another study, all looking at a cohort, meaning a group of people you follow through in time, looked at emotional and behavioral problems of children and found, again, increased hyperactivity if the child had started to use a phone at age 7. And unfortunately, growing numbers of children are using phones, and their parents don't realize that a phone is a two-way microwave radio. And it should not be used as a child, should not be used as a toy, and if you have to give it to a child, put it on airplane mode. If you're on a long car trip and the child is freaking out, put the phone on airplane mode with whatever you want to amuse them with, but do not give a child an active cell phone for any long period of time. It has an effect on the brain. It has an effect on the brain because it's so attractive and it stimulates dopamine. Dopamine is the part of the brain that makes us feel pleasure and happy. Other studies have found that memory of adolescence is affected by cell phone use, and the teens who use cell phones most have reduced spatial memory. Studies in Korea have identified a syndrome they call digital dementia. Amazing. Digital dementia. What that refers to is that functional MRIs of the brain of middle school children show that there's less development in the part of the brain involved in empathy, judgment, and impulse control. Think about that. We're raising a generation of children who are going to be lacking impulse control, judgment. We know from animal studies that cell phone radiation affects the hippocampus, which is critical to memory, balance, as well as synthesizing information. So these things have biological effects, and these studies have been done in many other countries showing effects of toxicants. And this one showed that if a child had higher lead levels than they used a cell phone, that the damage was much greater. Children who live near a base station have been shown to have more cognitive health problems, delays in fine and gross motor skills, and attention problems. Now, this is a wonderful psychiatrist I met recently, Victoria Dunkley, and she recommends what she calls an electronic fast, for children especially, but for the family. She recommends that families need rules. Put your device away at dinner time. Parents have to take phones away at night, no matter how desperate the child may seem. And of course, you want to withdraw these things and not have screens substitute for you or become the babysitter or the default, because the screen time can induce a state of hyperarousal, which really affects the body clock, including your ability to go to sleep, by the way. So this is just one of many studies showing adverse effects of screen time on children. I just show you the title page so that you know there's some more going on. This is an important finding produced on breast cancer. Unfortunately, we have 4 21-year-olds with no family history and no risk factors, but they have tumors that formed right under the antenna of their phones in their breasts. And unfortunately, some of them are quite ill. The CDC has reported that cancer is increasing among U.S. children. And there's no explanation for it. There's no explanation. And again, we don't know from these trends what the causes are, but we do know that there's something going on that we have to do a better job of avoiding and controlling. Because when lung cancer first started to increase, when people were smoking tobacco, people wondered what it was, what could be causing it. And that wonder went on far too long. It took far too long before we began to control tobacco. I don't think there's anyone that would debate that. I want to show you this so you'll get some information about how phones are tested, but I think, again, if we don't have the sound, just watch. This was a test that was done by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where they went, here's the machine, you see dipping into a model of a person, and what they found after testing it with this $250,000 machine, by the way, was that phones exceeded by 3 to 4-fold when tested with the FCC's protocol. And you can find this on our website. We'll make the slides available as well. And again, this is an important paper by several scientists, one of whom was the editor for the IARC of their 2011 report. And it concludes that if you were to look at all the evidence today, if IARC were to convene it, they would conclude that wireless radiation is a human carcinogen. And by the way, the International Agency for Research on Cancer will be evaluating this coming up soon in the future. Now, this is what happened in France. The French are different. They actually went out and tested phones. They didn't believe there was a problem, but here's what they found. These test results are the test results using the manufacturer's recommended distance of 10 millimeter. When they tested it at 5 millimeters, you see the value 1.45. That's still within the limit, which is 2. But this is what happened when they test the phone on the body. That's more than double the current limit. And these data, this is just one example, these data, 9 out of 10 phones exceeded the limits when tested on the body. Now, very few people use a holster nowadays to carry their phone. And yet the standard, which again was set in 1996, allows a holster of up to an inch off the body. So it's very unrealistic. So all of these phones are exceeding the limits. This is, if you look here, this is what the excess was. All of these are well over the 2 watts per kilogram standard for all of these phones. And if you apply the US standard, which is more stringent, it's even higher. PhoneGate is an organization that was founded by my colleague, Dr. Marc Arazi, in France. And they, based on these results, they have challenged the European Union, and 17 phones in France have been recalled or removed. And American phones, nothing has happened with them. And I don't know what your regulatory authority may or may not be here, but I think if you are happy and healthy, you may want to consider whether you want to examine at least the French data, which have already been developed at costs of millions of dollars. We're not going to be able to show this because we don't have the video. But basically, the Chicago Tribune in the United States tested phones as well. You know, it's interesting to me that everybody wants to do their own tests because they think that somebody else's tests might be wrong. But they're all using these FCC-approved laboratories, right? And you use the FCC-approved laboratory, and they show that phones exceed the limits. And the Chicago Tribune showed, again, these results here, that even at 2 millimeters off the body, the levels were well beyond what the limits are. And as a consequence in the United States today, there are several lawsuits underway. Those of you who employ people and require them to use cell phones are going to face increased liability because there are lawsuits that have already been won by people who claim that they developed tumors as a result of their workplace requirements to use phones. Now, the small cell rollout, there's nothing small about these small cells. I'm going to show you a few pictures of what they look like. They will need to be located every 2 to 10 homes. You have such a beautiful area here. It's hard to imagine what it might look like if you went wireless for 5G. But there is an alternative. We, my scientists, my colleagues and I have joined together to call for a moratorium on 5G until we have adequately studied it. We're talking about wireless 5G. But in the meantime, you already have the backbone. You have fiber optic cable. That's what all that cable construction that's been going on here, that's what that is. You have to have cable in order for the system to work. So a very simple solution to this problem is to take the cable and run it right to the bank and to the businesses that want 5G. If you run the cable to and through, then you don't need wireless at all. You won't have to be exposed to wireless radiation outside your bedroom because your neighbor decided to play Words with Friends at 1 in the morning. The Baby Safe project is something I'm proud to be part of that was started with colleagues such as Hugh Taylor, who is Chief of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Yale University. And we have more than 250 doctors now, obstetricians and gynecologists, educators, who are all urging pregnant women to get the phone off their abdomens. In the United States, they're talking about installing up to 2 million new antennas, and more than 100 cities have filed lawsuits objecting and refusing to go ahead with this planned rollout. Many medical organizations and expert groups are recommending reducing radio frequency exposures. This is a list of some of them, and I won't go through it. Again, more information is available on the website for Environmental Health Trust. I'm not going to be able to show you this, but I will tell you that the US government has a weapon called active denial system. Again, these videos are on our website. And this weapon uses a high-powered form of millimeter waves in order to make a targeted group of people feel like their skin is on fire. It's at high power, okay? And it has been used in Afghanistan and other places, but it's using a millimeter wave at high power as a weapon. In Congress, we have a number of leaders who have written to the FCC asking for evidence on safety, and they have been met with a very disappointing response, shall we say. Here's what's happening in other countries. Switzerland, in Jura, Genève, Neuchâtel, and Vaud, have adopted resolutions for a moratorium, and the cabinet agreed to have an assessment of the risks. Just like there are smoke-free zones, to have magnetic and electromagnetic-free zones, based on the precautionary principle. It's better to be safe than sorry. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the other cities and towns that have done things here, but I will just show you one thing that is very important for you to know. Wireless companies warn their shareholders that they face vulnerability because of pending lawsuits and litigation relating to this issue. And they cannot get secondary insurance often for health damages from electromagnetic fields. So it's a business risk. It's a huge risk to many businesses. In New Hampshire, this is a bill establishing a commission to study the environmental and health effects. And in the bill for this commission, they refer to thousands of studies and the National Toxicology Program study that I showed you earlier today, and raise questions about why my colleagues and I have written to the United Nations to protect public health. This is an example of what's being done in the state of Louisiana, hardly known for its leadership in this issue, but this is an example of how around the world today, from Louisiana to Switzerland, citizens are working with policymakers to say, wait a minute, where's the proof of safety before we expose everybody to this? Now, my solution, and it's not mine alone, is that fiber optic cable is here. You can send 3G, 4G, or 5G on fiber optic cable. So use the cable. If people want the 5G to wire it to their home, but make business and emergency response the #1 priority. Provide it to the factories that are going to have the robots, which I don't know if you're going to have any here. Provide it to the banks that need security and speed, which they do. And make sure that those that need it will have access to wired 5G, which will be safe G. And I think that's where we need to go. Let me just show you one final thing. I'm going to go through. You've seen this poster right outside this hall, and I want to say thank you to all of those who are working on this issue. I appreciate very much that you've come together to try to keep this beautiful place beautiful, and I think there is a solution of wired, and I want you to keep this in mind when you consider the response that you get from time to time. That there were those who said, you know, we better wait for more proof when it came to tobacco. And for years, there was a discussion that whether people who got lung cancer had genetic vulnerability. There was the same discussion about asbestos for years. And yet, if we had acted on asbestos, if we had acted on tobacco, how many lives would we have saved? Where we are now is that we are at a crossroads. And you are in a monumentally important point in human history, whether you know it or not, because you have attained a critical mass. Look at you. You're here. You want to know more about this issue. And I'm really grateful that you exist. And I'm very grateful to all of those who put together Stop 5G, because I'm not opposed to technology at all. I use it. I'm in favor of health. And I think it's time for us to reset the way we've been approaching this technology and to take a more sensible approach to making it safer for ourselves and our children. Thank you.
Hi there, it's Rupert Dorey. Could you tell us what answers the proponents of 5G give, or what sort of rebuttals they give to the arguments and risks that you have just highlighted, please?
Well, You'll have to ask them, but I can tell you that one of them is that they have taken great pains to try to take apart the National Toxicology Program study, and they attack the science and they attack the scientists, and I've written about this in my book. That strategy has been going on for quite some time. And as a consequence, if you look at sponsorship of research, the studies that are sponsored by industry tend to find no problem, and the studies that are independent, of which there are fewer, tend to find a problem. Right? So we are not dealing with a level playing field here, and that's something that I think the public has a right to know. I don't think it will shock you, because you know what happened with tobacco. For years, respected universities did tobacco research. They did. And when in 1984, I was a young scientist at the National Academy of Sciences, and we debated whether or not it was okay to have smoking on airplanes. Do you remember that? Smoking? People debated it. They said, well, it's not a problem. You know, we've had it for years. Why worry about it? Well, I'm afraid that I see a lot of similarity in the discussion today with that discussion about tobacco and what we're having now about this issue. So the answer is, it's not a level playing field, and I think that there are, however, growing numbers of people inside the industry that recognize that if they make it wired, and not wired so that you can have more wireless everywhere, but wired all the way through, that would reduce most of these concerns. And yet, I think, frankly, the majority of this industry is still fighting, as they did historically. They're still fighting. So it's unfortunate, because when I have a chance to talk to real scientists about this, they say, oh, well, yes, of course I would never keep a phone in my pocket. And Steve Jobs and Bill Gates never let their children use cell phones or play with toys, right? But they made gazillions of dollars selling them to everybody else. Historically, the cancer business, and it's a huge business, has focused on treatment. Now, if you've faced, as I have with my family members, a diagnosis of cancer, you don't really care about prevention. You want treatment, of course. But, and that is a very compelling thing, and you can raise funds from people who are sick and dying. And it's a tragedy when families are faced with cancer, especially brain cancer, which often affects these people when they're very young and transforms their personalities, costs over $1 million to treat over a lifetime. It's a very challenging. And for cancer, the cancer societies, if you think about it, are all focused on treatment. That's their mission, and detection and improving treatment. And that's a valuable mission. But you're absolutely right. If they could pay more attention to prevention, we would all be better off. And I think that needs a new constituency, and perhaps people here can rally behind that issue. Prevention is always going to be less expensive and more effective than cure. It always will be. And yet the history of the cancer enterprise has not been very admirable in that regard. And again, I've written about that extensively in several of my books, but you make a very good point. You mentioned Jerry Phillips, and let me just explain, since other people here won't know who he is. Jerry Phillips is a scientist who, at the time he was doing research for the government, supported by the government and Motorola. There was a joint partnership between the US government and the cell phone industry in the 1990s to do a huge study, and he was part of that. And when two scientists at the University of Washington, Lai and Singh, produced studies showing that cell phone radiation damaged the DNA in the brain, they did that in 1994. And then the industry hired Jerry Phillips to replicate their study to show it was false. Well, he replicated their study and showed it was true. So then they went after him. And when his article was published, they actually had changed some wording in the final proof, which he doesn't know how it got changed. He has now become more outspoken about his whole experience. So you asked me about the science and what they say, and that's an example, unfortunately, of what has gone on in this industry.
Hi, I was very interested to see your slide on the exposure initially to the carcinogen and then the exposure to EMFs, because we are an island and we are have granite on our island, and inevitably radon comes with that. So would you say then that potentially, and obviously we would need to conduct a study on that, that with the exposure that we already have to radon, that, let's face it, we can't get rid of, plus the additional exposure to EMFs could potentially further exacerbate Guernsey, Jersey, and other islands like us?
Radon is something that can be mitigated in basements of homes. There's a way to do that. And I don't know if it's a technology that's familiar here or not, but I am familiar with it, and I would encourage you to. Radon can vary greatly between one home to another. They can be right next to each other, and the levels of radon, which is a natural radioactive decay gas that comes out of granite, can vary radically from home to home. That's number one, and there are ways to deal with it. But your question is an excellent question, and I think the answer is, as a scientist, I don't know, but I think you're probably onto something. And what we know is that the cell phone radiation weakens membranes, right? You saw what happened to the cells of the testis, they got, okay? And on a general level, if membranes are weakened, then anything else in your body you're exposed to is going to be taken more deeply into your cells. So I think that's an excellent question, and that obviously is a further reason to take precaution, because you can't prevent some exposures because you live here, but you certainly want to reduce the others that you can, to identify and reduce the avoidable causes of cancer. That's the key to prevention.
I wanted to ask a question with regard to litigation and what success, in fact, have individuals had in litigating against telecoms companies and government bodies that have actually agreed to 5G in their areas.
Yeah, well, I know of no lawsuits specifically on 5G against the government, and I think the US government, like most governments, indemnifies itself from lawsuits. It's very difficult to sue the government for damages, for asbestos or for anything, by the way. But there are lawsuits now pending on 5G. Again, over 100 cities have filed suit in the Ninth Circuit. It's been consolidated in the United States, claiming that the current proposal for 5G is an overreach of federal authority, because what's happened in the United States, and I don't know if it can't happen here. Actually, that's one of the advantages of being a small entity as you are, is you can set your own policy and your own rules, and I would encourage you to do that. But in the United States, the federal government actually said, you, cities and states, have no authority to cite 5G anywhere. We decide. And once we decide, that's it. All you can do is try to raise questions about, I think it's historic issues. You cannot object on the grounds of public health or environmental impact. Now that is why it's being challenged in the court. And I think they're going to be successful, because it's such an overreach but that doesn't mean that 5G is going to go away. That's why I think we need to think strategically here. And by the way, there are advantages. 5G is amazing for some things that can be done with it. It can speed up processing phenomenally. It can speed up robotic production. It belongs in the business world. It belongs in commerce. It will improve security in banking, which we know is a huge issue. But there is, in my opinion, I don't want it in my home. I don't want it in my bedroom, because my neighbor decided to play a game at night. I want my home to be a haven where I can control exposures to the extent that I can. And that's our challenge right now, because the way 5G is being planned, it will be wireless everywhere, and you will not be able to escape. 24/7, there'll be wireless everywhere, because for 5G to be effective, for you get the handshake, it's got to be every 3 to 10 homes. That's what they're saying. And because 5G millimeter waves don't go through trees, on some circumstances you'll be cutting down trees. That's all in the proposal in the United States today. And that's why so many people are objecting, not only in the United States, but in Switzerland and many other countries, which we have listed on our website. So I encourage you to look at that information.
Thanks. I think I speak for myself and probably the majority of the audience who are likely time-starved in their lives. I just want to ask you, in terms of the next steps to perhaps educate yourself and probably more importantly protect yourself and your family, what would you do after this talk today?
Well, we have lots of information on our website about what you can do to protect yourself. You can start with getting your phone off your body unless it's on airplane mode. That's very simple. You can start with simple things for your children, knowing that distance is your friend. So for example, you notice they don't call them laptops anymore. They call them tablets because they belong on tables. Very simple things. If you kept your iPad on a table, it would be a lot better for you in terms of exposure. And there are ways to wire your home. You can wire an iPad, believe it or not. You can wire everything you have, even including your phone, can be wired. And wired is faster, safer, and you don't get the wireless exposure that I am very concerned about. And it's not that hard to do this, all right? I mean, do you remember an Ethernet cable, what an Ethernet connection is? That's all you need to do. And there's ways to do it. And it will have dramatic improvement in so many basic things of life. Recently, a friend of mine who's in her 80s, very smart lady, was having great difficulty sleeping, and she was having great difficulty with ringing in her ears. And it turned out she'd gotten hearing aids that were Bluetooth enabled, that were going right through her brain. Very, very weak. A lot of hearing aids do that. Now, if you get battery-powered hearing aids that don't necessarily go through the brain, and you have to ask for them, that reduces exposure. So we got her different hearing aids, and it turned out that her bedroom was really buzzy with a lot of exposure that they were able to unplug. Things like, the virtual personal assistants and stuff, you can wire all of that. And we have information on that on our site, and I would just encourage you to look for it because it's the first step. And I think also with children in schools, growing numbers of teachers are raising questions about how well are children really learning today when they're spending all their time in front of a screen. And there's a backlash now that's formed with being led by teachers, particularly elementary school teachers, who are seeing kids coming to school expecting to be entertained because they're so used to things moving so fast on the screen, and the capacity to be still, to pay attention, to look people in the eye, that's really diminishing. And we know that children need to learn those things when they're young, because if they don't learn them when they're young, Lord save us for when they're older.
Yeah, I was interested to hear tonight that, and it's come up again in the last question, Guernsey is under a lot of pressure to have a digital economy for business and for education. And for some time now, there's been political and professional consensus that what we needed was a grid for learning with much faster, slicker connectivity in the school and student environment. And I went round to a school even where 6-year-olds were on iPads all day long. Are we being misled then in a way by this curriculum philosophy, or perhaps it needs rebalancing?
Well, I definitely think it's most unfortunate to think that you should put 6-year-olds in front of a screen all day. There's absolutely nothing to justify that. And to make it even worse, the argument is made that disadvantaged children need even more of it because they're not getting enough stimulation at home. Well, let's assume they're not getting enough stimulation at home. In fact, in terms of social class, those that use the iPad and phones as babysitters the most are the poorest, the single moms who don't have any alternatives, who are completely overwhelmed with life as it is. And they are relying more on this. Now, let's separate some things out that you said. You talked about the digital economy. I think the digital economy overall is a good thing. However, However, there are still, you have to have safety within it in terms of fraud and all the other things that can go on. And we've seen the Eastern Europeans, whether it's Ukraine or Russia, are masters at manipulating cybersecurity, currencies, and the like. So we have to be vigilant about that. I'm not opposed to digitization in the workplace or in commerce. I just, again, want it to be wired. As a matter of fact, though, every bank that is using the digital world is wired. They have to be. Otherwise, they're vulnerable to hacking, more vulnerable to hacking. And although wired can still be hacked, it's a lot more difficult, a lot more difficult. As to children, I agree with you. It's a very troubling matter, as there are companies that have bet on their ability to sell schools on the need that everybody's got to be wired on the screen all the time. And there's no data to support that, none, certainly in elementary schools. Having said that, however, we want our children to be digital citizens. We do. We want them to know. But let me tell you something. If anybody's ever seen what happens, you give an 8-year-old a screen who hasn't had one before, and there aren't too many of them, by the way, and they get it within seconds. These kids, and the reason is that those fast-moving, colorful images, they really get into the brain. They really give it it's almost like crack, in that it really hits the dopamine receptor, and it makes you feel good. And then you, in addition to the physiology of it, you've got the fact that the software is programmed, so everybody wants likes and friends. They're not real friends, of course, and they're not real likes, but it's created a whole artificial world in which some children live, and we're seeing growing amounts of depression in children. Even suicide rates are growing in middle school kids. We never saw things like that before. And I'm not saying this is all due to wireless radiation. Please, don't come away with the thought that I'm condemning all of this. I'm a user of the technology. I find it fascinating, and I love using it. I would never, however, put anything in front of my brain that had wireless radiation, unless it was for a diagnostic medical purpose, which there are, by the way, because the same technology can be used to find tumors as well as, unfortunately, I think, causing them. And there's more and more in medicine, there's more and more uses of this, which can be very revolutionary. It's just that we need to be much more sophisticated in how we approach the technology and what parts of it we allow into our lives. On a personal level, family life is being reformed before our eyes by some of the unthinking acceptance of this technology, where people will sit down at dinner. You see them, they'll go out to dinner with a group of family, and they're all looking at their phones. They're not talking. They're not. And yeah, of course, teenagers say, "How are you?" "Fine." "What did you do today?" "Nothing." We know that's part of life, right? But you've got to still get through it. You've got to be the parent of the teen that is really bored and I don't care, because that's part of what it is to grow up. And if we're taking that part of life away and we're giving it up as a parent to the internet, where these children, my nieces are teachers, and they tell me that children in middle school are going to pornography. Middle school kids. And this is completely overwhelming for these children. And that's what happens within a day or two. My niece said, you give a boy a phone with access to the internet, and he's 10 years old, and within a day he's found pornography. And that's not a good thing for the children, or frankly for their parents, who then have to talk to them about how people really don't act like that. Right. So it's a challenge. It is definitely a challenge. And I want to thank you for coming tonight, because you see, you're here. And so you can talk to others and other parents who share your concerns. And there's an African proverb I will mention that my mentor, Al Gore, used to use quite a bit. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And you have a great opportunity here to do something that is being done in small areas where you have sophisticated audience, which you obviously have, people who have the resources to care, and who have already an environment that's worth protecting. I mean, this is such a glorious place. I'm appalled that I'm here for one day, but it is absolutely beautiful, and you want to keep it that way. I can't imagine what this place would look like with 5G antennas all over the place. And they can make them look pretty Tony, by the way. They can put them in street lamps, they can disguise them as a school mascot, etc. So, it's up to you.
Thank you very much for a very cogent and convincing that there is a linkage. That's great. But I didn't get a sense of the scale. And that to me is much more material. We've just had articles in the paper that I can now eat red meat and sausages because they don't cause me carcinogen impact. And we're on this beautiful island, but we look straight out at the nuclear power station. And that poses a risk. And I would hope that risk is absolutely minuscule, and I'm prepared to trade that risk for living on this island. You talk about minor cancers in which we have 8 times higher, but that's a minor number 8 times more. And I have to kind of trade that all the time. You associate it with tobacco, and the toxicology of tobacco is an entirely different order at the moment from what you appear to be suggesting. So it's the scaling of that gives me some concern, and to place it in perspective.
That's a good point. I couldn't argue. Brain cancer right now is a rate of about 7 per 100,000. So if it quadrupled, it would be 28 per 100,000. You don't even have 100,000 people here. You probably have very few cases of brain cancer here. I hope you do. Because if you're the unlucky one with that brain cancer, it's a miserable, miserable disease. I don't want to leave you with the idea that the only problem is brain cancer or acoustic neuroma, a tumor on the hearing nerve. What the National Toxicology Program data suggests to me is that this exposure can cause a lot of problems, and because of that, from the point of view of the science, the baseline rate, let us assume for a moment that this worsens heart disease, because I think it will, because it causes cardiomyopathy in animals. But the baseline rate of heart disease, which is the #1 chronic illness here, is so high that if there is a difference, you will never see it. Do you understand? We're talking about a very common illness. And so my feeling is that what we're dealing with here is something that is going to worsen many different types of chronic illness. And as an epidemiologist, I will never be able to show you that. As a toxicologist, which I also am, what I can show you is that we have experiments that show that this damages DNA, that it increases free radicals, that it causes markers of inflammation, all of which we know are associated with neurodegenerative diseases, cardiac diseases, and cancer. But the proof, again, if you need the dead bodies for proof, we're not going to have them for another 30 years. And yes, you're right. What I've talked about with brain is a rare thing. But this is not the only thing we have to be concerned about. It's really not.
Okay, just leading on from some of the previous questions, I remember on one of the slides, I think you mentioned something about digital dementia.
Yes.
I was just wondering, like some clarification, do you think that's caused by people or children, I think you mentioned, actually using the devices, with those faster flickering images as you suggested, or is it a result of the actual radiation from the devices in the brain, or a combination of the two?
That's a really good question. And the answer is I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. And I'm not sure how we would find that out, except I don't think we should do experiments on children. And ironically, we are experimenting on all of us right now. We're part of a massive, uncontrolled experiment. Who's the control group, right? And we don't have one. So, by the way, in epidemiology, what we usually do, because we don't have a control group, is we take people and we try to get information on, let's say, diet and fat, okay? Everybody has to eat, right? So we try to get information on how much fat do you eat, low, medium, and high. And then we evaluate the low versus the high. That's what we do. Well, for cell phones, we have a great deal of difficulty doing that kind of work because we don't have valid data on how often you use a phone, where do you keep the phone, do you have it Which side of the head do you use it on? Do you hold it next to your head at all? These things are changing so quickly, and the technology is changing, the uses are changing, and the users are changing. We never used to have toddlers using cell phones. Now, there are 10,000 apps for infants and toddlers. 10,000 apps for infants and toddlers. There's an iPhone teething rattle case and an iPad teething rattle case. I didn't show you, there's an iPotty, a potty for a child to learn how to use the toilet. So we have applications that never existed before, and our ability to sort out the answer to your question is probably, we'll never know for sure, but what we can say is this. We have good modeling data that show that a child's brain gets more exposure than an adult. And for an infant, it's going all the way through. So please, if you know anybody who gives their phone to a baby, from now on, please tell them, put it on airplane mode and try to avoid it generally, right? Because babies, have you ever seen babies with the iPads and they go, and they get stoned. They get stoned. And if you try to take it away, they really throw a temper tantrum. You've seen it happen with little kids. And I actually know some old guys that get like that a little bit. Just a minute, I'm just checking one more thing. Hold on, wait. No, I'm almost done, really. Just hang on. Where people can't let go. And they don't even understand they're being drawn in a way that people don't really appreciate. It starts with the first step in a 12-step program, right, is I have a problem, right? So if we recognize that all of us have a problem, that we need to address it in different ways, I think that we'll make some progress. But that's a very good question.
Hi. I thought I'd just talk about wireless networks in general, because there's a whole range of different frequencies and powers. And so although it feels like a sort of crusade against wireless networks, is it just 5G that you're kind of mainly highlighting as the main risk area, or is this kind of against all spectrums of power?
Oh, well, I can't, first of all, it's not a crusade. I mean, I think, okay, but...
So I didn't mean to say crusade.
No, that's okay. I know, but I am really concerned about all forms of wireless radiation based on the research that I showed you this evening, and based on what the World Health Organization said in 2011, and what other scientists are now saying now. Yes, I'm concerned about wireless radiation. I generally think 4 words: distance is your friend, right? For almost any exposure you have to anything, the further away you get, the better off you are. And let me put it like this. If somebody had said to you, should we have cars or are they dangerous? That discussion actually did take place, by the way. When cars were first being introduced, there was a debate about, can we really afford to put cars that are going to interfere with our horses? I remember that was way back when, okay? And I think where we are with phones today is where we were with cars in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there were some who warned that we needed seat belts and airbags and we would save lives. And by the way, the technology existed, but it cost a little bit of more money. I think where we are with wireless technology today is that we need airbags and seat belts, so to speak. We need to design it more safely. Let me give you just one example. Huawei, the Chinese company, made a baby-safe router. And they got into trouble because they said, why are you telling people it's baby safe? Well, because it turns itself off, except when it's needed. Why is that baby safe? Because it means less radiation. And less radiation is always good. And so that kind of change in technology, if you said, we will only take routers that turn themselves off when they're not being used, then you're saving electricity. You're reducing the pollution from that power plant because you don't need it as much. Because on a global scale, if all of these devices went to sleep when they weren't being used, you'd be saving energy and you'd be saving battery life and you'd be saving your exposures. So I think that, yes, you're right. There is a concern that I and many scientists have about wireless radiation, but I'm not suggesting that we're going to get rid of it. There are others who do say that. I'm not one of them. Right? I'm saying we have to make it safer.
And we are with these technology today where we were with cars in the 1960s, because we know we can do it. And there are ways to do it even right now, with software changes, like I just said, in the router, as an example. Thank you.